In 1842, a gravedigger in London's Clare Market Cemetery made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. While digging a new grave, his shovel struck something hard. A coffin. Not unusual, except this coffin was only 3 years old. When he pried it open to make room for the new burial, he found himself staring at a set of teeth he recognized immediately. They belonged to his father. This wasn't a horror story. This was happening in hundreds of graveyards, across London, every single week. A city of 2 million people, built on top of 20 million corpses. Every year, 50,000 people died in this city. And every year, those 50,000 bodies had to go somewhere. But here's the problem no one wanted to talk about. London had run out of room for the dead. The city that had survived Roman withdrawal, Viking raids, and the Black Death was now facing an enemy it had never encountered before: its own corpses. What happened next wasn't just a public health crisis. It was a disaster decades in the making. It was an engineering catastrophe, a biological time bomb, ticking beneath the feet of 2 million people, and no one knew how to stop it. And the fuse? It had already been lit. To understand the magnitude of this disaster, you need to understand Victorian London. By 1840, London was the largest city the world had ever seen. 2 million souls, packed into a space designed for a fraction of that number. The wealthy escaped to their country estates, while the poor were born, lived, and died within the same cramped streets. Every system was failing. Every resource was stretched, and every graveyard was full. The population had doubled in just 40 years, and it showed no signs of slowing down. This was the London of Charles Dickens, a city of brutal contrasts. The wealthy lived in Mayfair and Belgravia in extraordinary comfort. They could afford the best doctors, the finest funerals, and private graves. The poor had no such privilege. The poor were crammed into East End slums, where entire families shared single rooms. Cholera outbreaks killed tens of thousands. The Thames was an open sewer. And everywhere, there was death. You could smell it in the air. You could see it in the faces. You could feel it in the ground beneath your feet. The dead were everywhere, and they were piling up. But where do you put 50,000 bodies when there's nowhere left to dig? 50,000 deaths per year. That's 137 bodies every single day. 137 funerals, 137 graves. Day after day, month after month, with no end in sight. But here's what the Victorians discovered. You can't just keep burying people in the same ground forever. London's burial grounds were small. Most were attached to parish churches, some no larger than a tennis court. Imagine burying your entire neighborhood in your backyard. The soil itself was turning into something else entirely. These plots had been receiving bodies for centuries. The soil wasn't soil anymore. It was something else entirely. A surgeon named George Alfred Walker decided to investigate. What he found would change British law forever. George Walker was not a man easily disturbed. As a surgeon in Victorian London, he had seen things that would make most people faint, but nothing prepared him for what he discovered in the city's burial grounds. What he uncovered would shock an entire nation. In 1839, Walker began a systematic investigation of London's graveyards. He visited dozens of sites, interviewed gravediggers, and documented conditions that read like something from a nightmare. What he heard from gravediggers made his blood run cold. These men had seen things no human should ever witness. At the burial ground, near Clare Market, the same one where that gravedigger found his father's teeth, Walker discovered that bodies were being stacked in shafts 20 feet deep. When the shaft filled up, gravediggers would simply dig it out again, removing the older remains to make room for new ones. The same ground, used over and over again. But removing is a polite word for what actually happened. Gravediggers would hack apart partially decomposed corpses. With axes, they would burn bones and open fires. Limbs were thrown into piles. Bones were sold to soap makers. Nothing was sacred, not even the dead. But the worst was yet to come. They would dump body parts into the sewers. One witness testified that he saw a gravedigger playing football with a human skull. The ground itself had become saturated with what Walker called human putrescence. Centuries of corpses had turned the ground into something unrecognizable. The soil was so contaminated that it had turned into a thick, greasy substance that stuck to shovels and boots. In some graveyards, the ground level had risen by several feet, not from added soil, but from accumulated human remains. The dead were pushing up through the earth itself. And then there was Enon Chapel. Enon Chapel stood on Clements Lane, near the Strand. From the outside, it looked like any other nonconformist chapel. But beneath its floorboards lay a basement that would become infamous throughout England. Between 1823 and 1842, the chapel's minister buried approximately 12,000 bodies in a space measuring 59 feet by 29 feet. That is roughly the size of a small swimming pool. The bodies were stacked so tightly that the basement floor rose by several feet. The smell became so overwhelming that the congregation above could barely breathe during services. Parishioners reported seeing body bugs, insects that bred in decomposing flesh, crawling up through the floorboards during sermons. When the chapel finally closed, investigators discovered that the minister had been dumping bodies into the nearby sewer to make room for more paying customers. The Thames, already London's main water source, was being fed a steady diet of human remains. Walker published his findings in a series of pamphlets that shocked Victorian society. He earned the nickname Graveyard Walker, a title he wore with grim pride. His work caught the attention of Edwin Chadwick, the great sanitary reformer, who incorporated Walker's evidence into his landmark 1842 report. The Victorians believed in miasma theory, the idea that disease was caused by bad air, by the foul smells emanating from rotting matter. They were wrong about the mechanism, but they were absolutely right about the danger. The gases produced by decomposing bodies are genuinely toxic. Hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, methane, carbon dioxide. These compounds don't just smell terrible, they can kill. And in London's overcrowded burial grounds, these gases had nowhere to go. The wealthy, seeking to preserve their loved ones, often chose lead-lined coffins. Lead was expensive, but it was supposed to protect the body from the indignities of decay. But no one anticipated what would happen next. What no one anticipated was the pressure. As a body decomposes, it produces gas. In a wooden coffin, this gas can escape through gaps in the wood. But in a sealed lid coffin, the gas builds up, and builds up, and builds up. Pressure that could crack stone, until the coffin explodes. This wasn't a theoretical concern. It happened regularly in London's church vaults and catacombs. Sextons, the church officials responsible for maintaining burial grounds, developed a grim solution. A practice so disturbing, it was kept secret from the families who paid for those coffins. They would tap the coffins, drilling small holes to release the accumulated gas before it could rupture the lead. Sometimes, they would hold a match to the hole, igniting the escaping methane in what they called a hygienic burn-off. Flames from the dead, lighting up the crypts of London's finest churches. Picture it, a church official standing in a dark vault surrounded by the dead, holding a flame to a coffin. and watching the gas ignite with a soft blue whoosh. This was standard practice in Victorian London, and no one spoke a word. The catacombs beneath churches like St. Bride's on Fleet Street became repositories of this horror. Bodies were stacked in niches along the walls, their lead coffins slowly swelling with gas. The air in these underground chambers was so foul that workers could only enter for short periods before being overcome. And remember, these catacombs weren't located in some remote cemetery. They were directly beneath churches where people gathered every Sunday. The congregation would sit in their pews, singing hymns, while beneath their feet, thousands of corpses slowly released their toxic gases into the building above. Walker documented cases of people becoming ill after attending services in churches with overcrowded vaults. He recorded instances of gravediggers dying from exposure to what he called graveyard gases. He argued, passionately and persistently, that London's burial practices were killing the living as surely as any plague. Over the next decade, 7 large cemeteries were established in what was then the rural outskirts of the city: Kensal Green, West Norwood, Highgate, Abney Park, Brompton, Nunhead, Tower Hamlets, and they were magnificent. Designed as landscaped gardens, they featured winding paths, ornamental trees, and elaborate monuments. They were places where the living could stroll among the dead, contemplating mortality in a setting of pastoral beauty. Highgate Cemetery, which opened in 1839, featured the famous Egyptian Avenue, a dramatic entrance flanked by obelisks and lotus columns, leading to the Circle of Lebanon. The coffins were placed in individual niches, separated from each other to allow air circulation. Brompton Cemetery, opened in 1840, included catacombs with space for thousands of coffins. These new cemeteries represented a revolution in how Victorians thought about death. Death was no longer something to be hidden in cramped churchyards. It was something to be celebrated, memorialized. Edwin Chadwick, armed with Walker's evidence and his own investigations, pushed for comprehensive reform. In 1850, Parliament passed the Metropolitan Interments Act, which gave the government power to close inner-city burial grounds and establish public cemeteries. But implementation was slow. Vested interests, church officials who profited from burial fees, undertakers who had established relationships with particular graveyards, fought against change. The poor, who couldn't afford plots in the new suburban cemeteries, continued to be buried in the same overcrowded grounds. It took another decade of agitation before the Burial Acts of 1852 and 1853 finally closed most of London's inner-city burial grounds for good. By then, the damage had been done. Generations of Londoners had been exposed to the toxic byproducts of inadequate burial practices. The exact death toll will never be known, but Walker estimated that thousands had died from diseases. The dead were killing the living, and the bodies remained. Beneath the streets of modern London, beneath the shops and offices and underground stations, lie the remains of millions of people buried over centuries of occupation. Construction projects regularly uncover mass graves from the plague years. The Victorian burial crisis teaches us something important about cities. They are systems, and systems can fail in unexpected ways. London had survived the Black Death, the Great Plague, the Great Fire, but it nearly choked on its own dead. The crisis wasn't caused by a single catastrophic event. It was caused by the slow accumulation of small decisions, each burial ground accepting just a few more bodies, each coffin packed just a little tighter. By the time anyone recognized the scale of the problem had become a crisis. George Walker spent his entire career fighting for reform. He testified before Parliament. He published pamphlets. He was mocked, dismissed, accused of exaggeration. But he was right. Today, London's magnificent 7 cemeteries are protected heritage sites. Highgate, with its overgrown Victorian monuments and famous residents, has become a tourist attraction. The horrors that Walker documented have faded into history, but the lesson remains. Cities are living organisms, and they must find ways to deal with their dead. When they fail to do so, the consequences can be catastrophic. The next time you walk through London, remember what lies beneath your feet.
I'm Daniel Crawford, and this has been Engineering of Death. If you found this video informative, please like and subscribe. And let me know in the comments, what other hidden histories would you like me to explore? Thank you for watching. See you soon.